welcome to this year's CHASM conference, which very sadly in many ways we had to move online at very short notice due to the train strikes. We were really looking forward to the first in-person conference for the first time in a couple of years, but it wasn't to be. But we're making the best of it, and we're going hybrid, and possibly it means that we're seeing more of you here today, more of you have been able to join, so that's great. The theme of the conference, environmental sustainability and household financial security, signals an emerging interest of CHASMs, not the financial security component, of course, but rather the connection with sustainability and transition to net zero. It's very timely and policy relevant given what we all know, given the cost of living crisis, given soaring gas and electricity bills. But we're keen to consider a slightly broader perspective. And Emma Stockdale's presentation on responsible investment in private pensions, for instance, does just that. We also want to consider what more we need to know, what more we should do to maintain and improve consumers' financial security and well-being over the longer term. So we hope that today's conference is a bit of a platform for discussing some of these key issues. We're delighted to welcome our 4 speakers today. Carl Packman, Fair by Design campaign at Barrow Cadbury Trust. Emma Stockdale, who I just mentioned, Nest Insight. Luke Murphy, IPPR, and last but not least, Johnny Marshall, Resolution Foundation, who will each give a different take on the conference theme. I'm really happy to say we're also joined today by Matt Depar, who is from UNC Greensborough. He's here on a visiting fellowship, a CHASM International Visiting Fellowship. He's Associate Professor at UNC, and he is going to offer an international perspective on the presentations on the theme of this year's conference. Before we are then joined by Adele Atkinson, there she is. Hello. Who I am even more happy to say has recently been appointed as Professor of Practice in Financial Literacy and Wellbeing here in CHASM. Adele is going to chair that panel discussion, and she will direct some questions to the panel and then also open up to the floor for questions, comments, thoughts. So that's the agenda. It's quite tightly packed. We will have a bit of a break today, just after 2:30. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carl, who is first up.
Thank you very much. And yeah, wait for those slides. Yeah, so thank you very much for inviting me to speak today on this very important subject. Certainly something that's very important for us, so a very timely conversation as well. The first couple of slides actually is going to be a bit of a whistle stop, as quick as I can, on who we are at Fair by Design and what we do, for those of you in the room who don't know, and to discuss, to illustrate what the poverty premium is as a concept. So we are hosted by Barrow Cadbury Trust, Fair by Design, but it's a two-pronged organisation, or unit if you want, which is an advocacy, change, campaign type organisation, lobbying government, regulators and corporates on the poverty premium and the extra cost of living. But it was also an investment fund to put money into new businesses, startups that seek to address the poverty premium as well. And we work from separate organisations, the fund and the change programme, but we are one unit. And our mission is obviously there to eliminate the poverty premium by 2028 or sooner if we can. But we work mainly across free markets, energy, insurance and credit. On the next slide, I'll just give you a whistle stop on what the poverty premium is for those who don't know. So for those on low incomes, the things that you buy can be very much more expensive. If you're buying energy, the way that you pay for your energy via a prepayment meter, for example, can be much more expensive than if you have a fixed standard variable tariff. If you're buying credit, sometimes you are obliged to buy credit from a high-cost credit provider where the interest rates can be eye-wateringly high, 3,000%. And that is compared to interest-free credit for relatively wealthier people. Similarly with insurance, if you live in an area where premiums are higher, you're more likely to be on a low income, and you're going to be paying a lot more for that level of service. So the poverty premium describes a situation where the ability to pay is much more expensive, and therefore it is much more expensive to be poor. One of those great ironies. So on the next slide, this is what we do. We commission research to better equip ourselves with knowledge on what the poverty premium is, who's exposed, where that exposure tends to be. We develop practical policy proposals, which means that we can usefully go out to policy regulators, to government, in order to give them the information that they need to know where the poverty premium is. And we've got a saying internally that what gets measured gets done. So when we're able to be better equipped with that data, with that information on the poverty premium, then we are better able to collaborate with regulators and government and industry to start to design out some of that pernicious aspect, some of those pernicious aspects of the poverty premium. And on the final slide on this bit for who we are, this is essentially how we are composed as an organisation. So you can see that on one side we have the venture fund, and on the other side we have the campaign. So on the next slide, sorry, so it was whistle stop tour. We were very influenced by a 2016 report on the poverty premium that was written by the Personal Finance Research Centre at the University of Bristol. They weren't the first to talk about the poverty premium in the UK, but they certainly were, I'd say, the most thorough, and they described the different components of the poverty premium, how that affects people in different ways with the essentials that they spend their money on, and the different markets that the poverty premium tends to come up on, and where people are most exposed to the poverty premium. Their findings are pretty consistent that from 2016, that energy was a big component of the poverty premium. We commissioned the university, the think tank within the university, to do an update on that research, and they found again that energy is a great expense for low-income households, and the gap between the deals and the tariffs that low-income households had access to versus those of relatively wealthier people was considerable in the energy market. And while we haven't got the absolute up-to-date figures, namely sort of 2022, we can quite imagine, given the energy crisis that is ongoing at the moment, that will be considerable as well. So the energy poverty premium, I'll just say a little bit more about here. The energy has gone up for everybody, but grows as a proportion of household spending for low-income households. And according to Jonathan Brearley, who is the CEO of Ofgem, the number of people in fuel poverty, where costs of energy exceed 10% of someone's income, is expected to rise to 12 million households. That's not 12 million people. Full Facts, the website Full Facts, investigated the figure recently to find that given the average household is 2.4 people, fuel poverty is expected to affect many more than 12 million people. My point here is that fuel poverty and people being pushed into poverty as a result of their fuel costs is growing, is on the growth. So we know that energy prices are going up. We're probably all feeling that, but the pernicious aspects of that for people already on low incomes is much harsher. And the reason this is happening, since April 2022, the price cap for energy, which is the price protection that Ofgem puts on the cost of energy bills, has risen by 54% to nearly £2,000. The wholesale cost of gas is to blame. In October 2022, energy bills were predicted to rise to an average £2,800 a year, an increase of over 40%. Now, currently, the energy crisis means that 6.5 million UK households are in fuel poverty, and that's up from 4 million in October 2021. So you can see the scale of that problem and the pernicious aspects of the crisis. And what I'm driving at here is that the cost of energy is skyrocketing for everyone, but it affects low-income households more because the proportion of spend, because of the existing poverty premium, And something I haven't mentioned already, that many low-income households live in leaky housing, or to put another way, poorly insulated housing stock that means more heat is wasted. And in order to heat a home adequately takes more energy. Next slide, that's okay. We now know more about the poverty premium. We published more research on this yesterday, and in particular the local impacts. So now we know that 1 in 8 British households are estimated to experience at least one type of poverty premium, one aspect of an extra cost on their essential services. The cost of the poverty premium to a typical parliamentary constituency is 4.5 million a year, and that equates to over £430 per year for a single low-income household, and that's equivalent to nearly 10 weeks of food shopping. The northeast of England has the highest proportion of households incurring the poverty premium, followed by the northwest and Yorkshire and Humber. And of the 632 constituencies in the UK, Leeds Central, Manchester Central, Hackney South, Shoreditch, they have the largest total of poverty premiums in the UK. It's a really interesting piece of work if you haven't seen it, also done by the University of Bristol, and really drills down into the impacts, the local impacts that the poverty premium is having. It's worth also noting my particular favourite aspect of that data, which I think is going to have a big impact, is that parliamentary seats that the Conservatives won from Labour at the 2019 election typically experience a higher proportion of people incurring the poverty premium than seats that the Conservatives previously held. So on their heads. Next slide, please, Anne. At the moment, we have a twofold problem. The energy market is not set up in a way that gives advantages to low-income people. They're penalised within the market as it is, but also in the movement towards making good on our net zero commitments, which is part of the reason why we're all here as well today. We also stand to disadvantage lower income households if we don't do something radical. And there's a bit of a backstory here, which I hope you'll indulge me on. In 2019, UK Parliament approved the motion to declare an environment and climate emergency, a year after warnings that to keep the rise in global temperatures below 1.5 C this century, all emissions of carbon dioxide would have to be cut by 45% by 2030. Now, this level of threat requires more than just piecemeal modifications around the edges, but significant change to the way in which we live, invest, and consume globally. At government level, among firms, corporate sector, local authorities, and in our immediate communities, and indeed in our own households. And given the scale and severity of the problem, there are huge institutional hurdles to jump. Increasing renewable energy sources, protecting land and oceans, plants and animals from harm intensified by greenhouse gases. And what's more, the necessary changes will impact our homes and providers of our energy sources. It includes how we pay for those services and how we heat and how we eat, essentially. The positive news, and that's the next slide, please. Positive news is that most of us are up for this. Lots of polling says that the public are up for reducing our use of carbon, so that's great. This is fortunate because the UK has a lot to achieve on this front, not only aligned to the main target set by the Committee on Climate Change that says every individual on the planet has the right to emit the same amount of greenhouse gases by 2050, but because the UK was the first to go through the Industrial Revolution, emitting those gases for longer than any other country, there requires an even bigger role for the UK to lower reliance on carbon. Now, how the UK has prioritised lowering that reliance to date is what is most relevant to me and most relevant to us at Fair by Design. Moving to more sustainable sources of household energy, which has an obvious impact on the cost of our energy bills. And even though improvements in energy efficiency and ongoing drops in the price of renewable power play a major role in reducing the cost of bills over time, it is widely accepted that shorter term costs are going to be higher. Some interesting research by Professor Jim Watson at the UK Energy Research Centre has shown that the British public are willing to accept some increase in their bills to help finance the future energy transition. However, in his words, this willingness is conditional only on the parallel commitment of energy companies and the government to help facilitate the increased use of more sustainable energy. Now, the point relevant to me and Fair by Design is irrespective of attitudes towards taking a hit in the pocket for the transition, many consumers simply don't have the slack in their budget to pay anymore. And as I discussed at the top of this presentation, not only do low-income consumers already pay proportionally more for their energy bills than higher income households, and that's around 1.5% of their household income, again, compared with under 0.2% for higher earners. Many incur a poverty premium for being defaulted to a standard tariff rather than the best deal, or penalised for not switching. A money-saving move that tends to favour those with more time and confidence to navigate complex markets digitally. The risk is perhaps obvious here. The UK generally doesn't mind doing their bit towards committing to net zero targets, but that won't be the case for everyone, not because people don't care, but because they can't afford to pay any more on their bills if the heat source is green, especially not now. And there's a secondary risk. There's a moral hazard that people not transitioning to greener fuels will be made to feel guilty for not doing so. And even though the reason is that people aren't enthusiastically moving green, at least in the short midterm, it's not a financial reason, it's a financial reason, not a moral one. And in summary, there's a dual challenge ahead of us. Finding that we can, what we can all do to play a part in reducing the environmental damage to the planet, and then ensuring that there is a just transition away from cheap and dirty natural gas over to a greener energy supply, which doesn't exacerbate existing pressures on low-income consumers already under serious financial strain, particularly where they are vulnerable or in vulnerable circumstances, in or at risk of fuel poverty or experiencing poverty more broadly. What we need to design out the poverty premium energy markets and make this transition easier for low-income communities. And this last bit is what Fair by Design is doing. We're lobbying government and regulators to remove a big part of these pressures on consumers to make sure that they're not paying more for their household heat. Now, next slide, sorry, I should have said that earlier. Other interventions are needed, of course. For example, increased funding for energy efficiency upgrades to take the financial burden away from those who can least afford it. Households living in homes with low energy efficiency ratings are more likely to be in fuel poverty and to live in cold, damp, uncomfortable conditions that deepen health inequalities. This is more likely to affect those most vulnerable households that often live in less affluent areas. But what we are at Fair by Design are specifically calling for is the reintroduction of a targeted social tariff for low-income households and those most at risk of fuel poverty. The energy price cap and other schemes are working very well, I believe, in this country. But we need additional measures now to ease the financial pressure on those households. Doing so would significantly lower the cost of energy and provide a safety net for households most exposed to the poverty premium. And we are publishing a report on what the social tariff should look like on July the 4th. And I'll hopefully be able to keep everyone here updated on the publication of that report. My feeling is that if we knock out this burden, the poverty premium, suddenly the move towards net zero and the part that we can all play, the part played by households, suddenly doesn't become too daunting after all. I'm going to leave that there.
Thank you, Carl. Thanks very much. I'm going to open to the floor just for 5 minutes, 5 minutes only. We've got quite a tight schedule, so we're going to keep to that. So if there's any particular questions relating to Carl's presentation now, then please do raise your hands or even type it in the chat. As I say, we have got the panel discussion later on, but if there's anything now that anybody wants to ask or comment on, please go ahead. Let's see any, no? Okay, in which case, I'm going to move on, or we're going to move on, I should say, to Emma Stockdale from Nest Insight.
Hello, thank you. Give me one moment to just share my screen. hopefully you should all be able to see that now, the slide deck. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some research Nest Insight I've been looking into around pension engagement and whether responsible investment is an effective way to engage pension members. This particular project was funded very kindly by Legal and General Investment Management, who I would like to thank for their involvement in this work. So to begin with, just to set the scene a little bit as to who Nest Insight are and what we're interested in. Nest Insight is a public benefit research and innovation centre. Our mission is to support find ways to support low and moderate income workers to be financially secure both today and into retirement. We conduct rigorous cutting-edge research, working collaboratively with industry and academic partners to understand the needs and behaviours of a new generation of savers that have been brought about by UK pension enrolment, but also sort of more and more looking broadly at sort of an individual saving picture, acknowledging that the impact that short-term saving can have on those more distant financial horizons. Our findings are shared widely and freely. There are a couple of papers that I'm going to speak about today that are available on our website. They contain quite a bit more detail than I'm going to have time to cover today, so I encourage you to have a look at those. Before I delve in, it's probably also important to mention that I'm a research trials manager. I don't work for the investment team in the Nest pension, so I'm not qualified to talk about their specific investment strategy. So with that caveat, let's begin by sort of setting the scene as to research in this area, looking at how ESG investment can be used as a driver for engagement in pensions and the perception of it. I have a few stats taken from a number of different providers. They are all fairly recent and demonstrate that in provider surveys, at least, that there seems to be some appeal in this kind of messaging. LGIM found 82% of defined contribution 82% of defined contribution members agreed that if they knew that their pension was rewarding and encouraging companies to have a positive impact through its investment strategy, that they would be more likely to engage with their pension. Pension B found 83% of savers expect their pension to be invested in companies paying the living wage, and 57% of savers want their pension to be invested responsibly to help tackle climate change. Of those who do not currently invest responsibly, a third say that they are more likely to do so when it's explained to them. So there's a lot of emphasis on ESG investments from different providers in the space, and a lot of hope pinned on that as a solution to some of the engagement challenges that are seen across the industry. Now, a lot of the evidence is based on self-report, and if we know one thing, there's a big gap between intentions and actions. So we set about to test the effect of ESG messaging on actual pension engagement. So specifically, we wanted to look at whether responsible investment messages were more effective than some of the other messages that we might communicate with members. We also wanted to look at the framing of the ESG messaging and how it can be most effectively communicated to drive engagement. Then also look at how these responses change, if at all, when looking at different demographic groups. So the men differ from women, the young people differ from older people. So before sort of answering these questions, we wanted to have a look a little bit more about what makes an effective ESG message. So my colleagues engaged in an extensive set of desk research and expert interviews with people with decades of experience in communicating environmental, social, ethical stories to customers and the public more broadly. They came from lots of different sectors, lots of different industries, and from that we determined there are sort of 5 key principles when communicating about ESG issues. So number one is that it has to be relevant to me. So we know people are more engaged with stories connected to their own personal context. So for example, their own region, their own work circumstances, their own experiences. Second, it has to come without sacrifice. So people want reassurance that there are no drawbacks to taking the socially responsible option, so that the essential features that they value in the product, whatever that product might be, are uncompromised. Third, it has to be win-win. So as well as no compromise, people also want to know that there is a benefit for them personally, as well as sort of the more broad environmental or social benefits. And fourth, it has to be backed up. So people do want credible evidence, they do want proof points, and people are increasingly aware of things like greenwashing, virtue signalling, and some of these sort of marketing spins. And finally, it has to be simple. So this is so much easier said than done, particularly when we're talking about pensions or investments. But we know people switch off when you start talking using jargon or technical language. So there are a few examples on this slide. So we have Carlsberg, who are keeping it simple. We have Ariel laundry detergent, providing reassurance that the eco option requires no sacrifice. And also from Ticker. So there's a reassurance there that you are making an impact relevant to the sort of COVID context by showing the role I play as an individual in the vaccine development that we heard so much about in 2020 through how I choose to invest. So we'd heard from the experts, and now it's time to go out and talk to members about what we were learning. So we conducted a survey with Nest members, and going into that, we expected different people to have different responses depending on their existing level of engagement and knowledge of ESG, but also engagement with their pension. So we segmented survey respondents against two different engagement axes. So higher to lower ESG engagement, that's shown in this slide with that plant. And more people, more engaged people were defined as those who selected 4 or more issues from a list of 20 as being extremely important to them personally. We then did the same with pension engagement. So people were high in pension engagement, that's the piggy bank icon here, if they self-reported visiting their pension provider's website or logged onto their account more than 5 times, had ever increased their contributions, or had transferred funds at some point from one pension provider over to another. So the purpose of this was to track differences in responses across these 4 groups, but we were particularly interested in those with higher ESG issue engagement and lower pension engagement. So that was about 1 in 5 people in this survey. These are the people for whom talking about ESG issues in the context of pensions is likely to have the greatest gain for pension engagement. Essentially, we're using interest in one area of their life to spur engagement in another. So with these groups in mind, we then set about testing some of that ESG messaging. Now, for speed, I am glossing over something important, and that's the fact that talking about ESG investment in pensions requires the knowledge that your pension is invested in the first place. So we have to remember that lots of pension savers aren't aware that their pension is invested. So we shouldn't necessarily rush straight into these types of messages, but instead look to build some foundational knowledge, some foundational understanding. So when in this study, we're interested in looking at engagement here, but we're starting at this marginal level of awareness and should be realistic about what outcomes these messages are going to produce in a study like this. So with that in mind, we had a look at whether responsible investment could help explain the concept of investment to members. So we tested 3 messages about how pensions are invested to grow your money, a more traditional explanation with no reference to ESG, a general description of responsible investment and a responsible investment approach, And then also a sort of more technical message that includes the ESG criteria. In this instance, the responsible investment version had the broadest appeal. So 9 out of 10 rated that as their first or second option, and half rated it first. We also had a look at how much weight these messages, the responsible investment part of a message should have in a broader message from a provider. So we had 3 different email mock-ups looking at how a pension pot was invested, and they all included a call to action that encouraged people to log on to their pension account to find out more. Number 1 didn't mention responsible investment at all. Number 2 gave some information about responsible investment, but it was a secondary supporting message. And the 3rd led with this responsible investment message. The email leading with the responsible investment message was the one that was ranked as the most likely for people to act on. But as you can see here, it's a pretty slight difference. And when you look at the broader appeal of those who ranked it first or second, 9 out of 10 people ranked the middle option as more appealing. So that supporting message. So it's likely that option, the supporting message option, is going to have a greater appeal for more people. Interestingly, among those with lower pension engagement and ESG engagement, we actually see that the standard message here, without the responsible investment, is the most appealing message. So not all ESG issues are equal. So it's quite small on the slides, but hopefully you can see, if you have a look at the pink column, these are the sort of issues, the different issues people think are important, and you can see that's, most of these issues are deemed as very important. And if you boil that down, then in the blue column to the issues that are most important, you can see a few areas like climate change and the living wage sort of stick out as being important. This research was done in 2020, so we could imagine that some of the differences in interests may have changed since then. So the living wage may be more relevant with the current cost of living crisis. We can also see from this chart that the messages that are local or personal in context could be more powerful. So we have good hospitals coming in above general disease prevention, or the living wage over executive pay issues. So the last thing we explored as part of the first part of this research was the framing of messages. It's well known that the way you say a message can impact the way people respond to that message. So we took the learnings from the desk research and the expert interviews and created 5 pairs of messages, and each pair framed a similar concept in a slightly different way. So looking at the top of this slide, we had one message talking about proactively seeking out ways to make a positive impact by investing your pensions. So for example, we are investing your money in companies that are fighting climate change and uphold human rights across their supply chain. That was paired with a message that has a similar approach, sort of semantically similar, but the framing was about avoiding the bad. So we do not invest your money in companies that have high fossil fuel use or employ child labour in their supply chain. So we saw a relatively strong member preference for the proactively good impact messages over the avoiding bad. And in sort of similar contrast messages as we go down, there was a slight preference for collective impact over the individual impact, so the we over the I, a slight preference for specific examples of the impact your investment is having over sort of general impact, a preference for local over global impact, and then at the bottom there, the responses to investments about financial or emotional returns are about equal, and a combination is likely to be more effective than in isolation here. And I think it sort of goes back a bit to what I was explaining on the previous slides, where you know, these sorts of issues don't trump the primary purpose of a product. So in pensions, arguably it is the financial return, and so that we see that here, that is still very important to people. Again, these responses varied by the 4 engagement groups that I identified earlier. Those with high ESG engagement and low pension engagement, they're the orange on this slide, possibly the most likely to engage in their pension saving as a result of these ESG message frames, showed a much stronger preference for the proactively good messages. Drawing your attention to the pink, we have those less engaged in ESG, but more engaged in the pensions, and you can see a much higher preference for the outcome for the individual. So you see a higher preference for the individual over the collective impact, the local over the global, and the financial returns over the emotional returns. So perhaps a stronger need there for connection and seeing the benefits for me. Now, we took all those learnings from the desk research and the expert interviews, the member survey, which could be applied in a number of ways, and we distilled it down into a very specific intervention to look at whether such messages improve engagement in retirement saving. So in retirement saving, we have quite a specific issue born out of a great success. So we have excellent pension coverage, but we also have an engagement issue as a result of the need for defaults in order to get that coverage, and arguably a pension system that is quite complicated to understand. So we need people to nominate a beneficiary, to update their address, to keep an eye on their pot size, to adjust contributions, and the engagement is just not quite as high as maybe we would like. Now, the Nest Pension Scheme already does responsible investment, so drawing attention to this specific aspect, we wanted to look at whether that would drive engagement. I think that's particularly interesting given the sort of strong claims made from providers about the power of ESG for engagement that I mentioned at the beginning of the slides. So we're looking at whether it is it the lever that we really think it is, and if it is, how do we do it well? So we took a pool of unregistered Nest members who were actively employed. They had never logged onto their Nest account. They had made a contribution in the last 6 months to their pension and were in the default fund. And they were randomised to one of 5 options. So we have the control group, they received no email. We had a standard saving email that sort of said, have you looked at your pension pot recently? And then had a call to action to log into your account, which was present in all of the messages. Then there is a generic investment message that tells the member that their pension is invested. Then a general responsible investment message, which mentions responsible investment in a sort of broad, generic way. And finally, there was a more specific responsible investment message. This was the longest message, and it included some detail on the types of issues that were included in the responsible investment. You can have a look at the actual messages in a little bit more detail about these groups in the papers that are available online. At the 4-week mark, we collected the outcome measures, and we also sent a follow-up survey. So in terms of outcomes, we were most interested in account registrations, but then also looking at email open rates and click-through as sort of measures of engagement as well. So what do we find? Well, account registration for all those who received an email increased regardless of demographic factors. So 4.46% on average across those who received an email went on to set up to register their account. The saving message was the most effective of them all and is significantly higher than the other 3 messages that were sent. And we probably have an argument that the complexity here is reducing the effect. So the sample this was sent to are arguably the least engaged members. And so it's perhaps unsurprising that a message that is very simple wins out here. Now, thinking about what is driving that difference, we can have a look at the click-through rates and the open rates. The open rates are pretty similar across the groups, and so it's unlikely that the emails were different in their appeal or attractiveness. But we start to see the differences in account registration at the point of click-through. Interestingly, the level of detail in the responsible investment emails, particularly the specific one, which is quite a bit more detailed, doesn't seem to be off-putting compared to the slightly lighter investment and general responsible investment emails. And I think that's a good sign that we don't seem to have a sort of backfiring effect necessarily here. And then if we do a sort of zoomed in look at the click-through rate as well, and have a look at individuals who score highly on ESG engagement, we can see that the general responsible investment email does have a greater appeal for them. So possibly messages that are more targeted to interests might be more effective here. So finally, we had some evidence that really any campaign that gets members to register their account is likely to be beneficial. Findings on this slide don't differ by the email received, but what we essentially see is that those who registered during the trial period know more about their pension and its size than those that don't register. Basically, what it seems to demonstrate is that it matters more that you get them there, that you get people registered, more than the method you use to do it. Any method you use to encourage members to take this first step to grow their confidence and their knowledge is potentially one step further forward on them taking other actions around their pension. So to sum up, responsible investment does seem to be important for those who care about those issues. There are high hopes in the industry about the effects of ESG investment and the influence they may have on engagement. But I think what this study demonstrates is that at least for that first engagement step with your least engaged members, simplicity is probably going to win out. Really meeting people where they are in their sort of knowledge journey is likely to be better than starting with any kind of sort of investment related message, particularly again thinking about those that maybe don't even realise that their pension is invested. This study demonstrates that because of the opportunity cost of getting it wrong, organisations should be thinking really carefully about how to engage inactive members. Is responsible investment the one way to do that? Yeah, possibly. Different pension schemes will have different demographics, and so we might expect different results in other contexts, messages, but we should certainly keep talking to members and keep trying to engage them in their pension. So yeah, thanks again for listening today. That was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. There is so much more detail in the reports that are available online. There's a couple of contact details here, so please do get in touch if you would like to discuss this further. We're really excited about it, and yeah, would love to chat further about it.
There's a slight delay here. Thanks very much. Does anybody have any questions at this point in time? Yeah, I can see a hand raised. Go ahead, Segal.
Yes, hi, thank you to everyone so far. My question was, there was this message given by the speaker that there is no slave labor for these in the new supply chains of the new solutions. So my roots are in India and Africa, and I've studied as an expert, someone who's studied a lot of supply chains from cradle to cradle. I've naturally decided to study what is the supply chains of these green solutions as an alternative to the fossil fuels. And eerily enough, and ironically, 30 to 40% fossil fuels is required to be burned to get the lithium and the cobalt out of the ground. Those ones who are getting the resources out of the ground are 60% labor force, which is women and children. I updated this knowledge yesterday when I actually looked at the supply chains all the way from Bolivia and South America to Congo, and also certain parts of India. And then the mines that are the fossil fuel mines, and the lithium and the cobalt and the bauxite, they are all owned mostly by the same companies. And those hedge funds that own those mines are BlackRock, mentioned on the first page. So my question is that in the 10 years I've been looking at this, who has taken an earnest look at the real sustainability, cradle to cradle, of these solutions, whether it be in Africa or whether it be somewhere in Yorkshire? Because I am seeing now mines being reopened in the UK, and in this recession, naturally, there are going to be some people desperate for work and desperate for money. And is it fair to say that there will be some people who are so desperate they will end up going for slave labor prices or wages? My question is how is any of these solutions sustainable when the people who are paying the highest price for our green renewable solutions are the people in the global south? We are meant to be not leaving behind, when also the majority of those being left behind are the women and their little offspring. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I think it's a little bit too broad for me to cover here, and obviously I'm not qualified to talk about BlackRock's sort of investments, but I think it raises a broad issue about transparency and how organisations go about working out what defines responsible investment for them, and the transparency in their approach when communicating it to customers. Customers rely on, particularly I think in pensions where it's sort of done for them in a lot of cases, they rely on the pension providers to make the decisions for them, and so it is their responsibility to sort of be looking into these issues and to be making decisions that are right for their members, and not just for the short term, but also for the long term. Yeah, it's a big topic. I think transparency is clearly key. You know, you're saying that you've looked into it for 10 years, and we can't expect pension members to be doing sort of the same checks. And so really it is the responsibility of pension providers in this instance to take a more active stance.
Could I quickly just say I've spoken to people from the London Stock Exchange. The guy told me that when you dig this amount of soil 2 miles deep, do you know what's really going on with the soil for these resources? I've spoken to people in the financial, insurance, indemnities, actuarial sector, and they say this is crazy, and the conflation of human rights as well. So my question again to the whole panel anywhere is if this is such a real emergency when we've got the equivalent of maybe half the population of Africa across the global south enslaved in mining these resources for our green solutions, I'm not really interested in whether BlackRock or Fidelity Investments has got the message about their hedge funds viability. I'm more interested in how we are under this delusion that these solutions are green when they're not. And my final question is, if these solutions were then had and obtained by the enslavement of people in the UK, white, black or brown, would we still sustain that solution? Thank you.
Thanks, Sagar. It's a great question. It's a far-reaching and contentious one, and I think one that we will pick up later on in the panel discussion in a little bit more detail. So thank you for that. Emma, I just very briefly wanted to also ask Chair's prerogative to and just bring your presentation, your fascinating presentation, back to this issue of sort of household financial security for now. And I don't expect you to have a prompt answer to this, but this is perhaps just one to have a look, think about for later on. Is messaging, of course, responsible investment messaging is one thing. It's a start. Perhaps there's a step before that, like you say, which is to just raise awareness of the fact that people's pension savings are invested in the first instance, because many people don't know that. But how can responsible pension investment impact sort of positively on financial security in later life? So how might that have a positive impact on household financial security? And if at all, is it about higher returns? And if so, who's going to benefit most from that? So what are the sort of, how even or uneven are the benefits? If you've got an immediate response to that, I'd love to hear it now. If not, then we'll perhaps pick it up later.
I would say sort of very quickly that it's not the same cost benefit sort of situation as it is when you're choosing to swap detergent and you have to decide whether it's going to wash your clothes as well as a non-ecological sort of one that's poorer for the environment, because it's sort of a myth that sort of ethical investment, the responsible investment, is a poorer place to put your money than other alternative investments. So the goal of a pension scheme is to grow your investments, and responsible investments should do that for you. Obviously, it depends on lots of factors, but the primary goal should be to be creating a pension pot that is going to provide you with an income in retirement, and if you can do that through responsible investments, then I think that's how you'd want to go. And I don't think there is a cost necessarily to doing so in terms of what you might expect in growth over the long term.
Thanks, Emma. Okay, we are now moving on to Luke Murphy from IPPR. So over to you, Luke, and then we follow that with a break.
Thanks very much. And can you just move that? Can you see my screen okay? You can just see the slide, right?
We can, yeah.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks very much for having me. And sorry we couldn't be doing this in person, but obviously understand why. But really good to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me. I mean, I guess as a bit of a background for who I am and who IPPR are, and IPPR is the Institute for Public Policy Research. We're the UK's leading progressive think tank, and we do policy advocacy work across a whole range of policy and issue areas, from health to transport to climate to economy to devolution. We have offices in London, staff across the UK based in Cardiff, Bristol, offices in Manchester and Scotland as well. So we have a genuinely kind of national footprint. And the big piece of work that my team and that I wanted to talk to today was around the Environmental Justice Commission, which was a 2-year piece of work, which actually concluded last year, when we're building on it now. And it's the kind of cross-party Environmental Justice Commission, and it was originally set up in June 2019 and was co-chaired by Ed Miliband and Caroline Lucas, by the Labour Party, Caroline Lucas from the Greens and Laura Sands from the Conservatives. And they were joined on the commission by a number of commissioners, including representatives from the trade union movement, from civil society, academia, and it was extremely broad. We had one of the founders of the UK climate strikes, youth climate strikes, and also a founder from Extinction Rebellion, all the way to representatives from the City of London Corporation. So it's a very kind of broad commission, and the aim was to see whether we could bring together such a broad group of people to identify and set out a vision and ultimately a plan with clear recommendations for what a fair transition for net zero and nature would look like. The commission reported last year, and as I said, IPPR are continuing to build on that work. The commission was really set up for to look at one crucial question, which was, how can we reduce emissions, restore nature? Yes, but also do so in a way that actually addresses wider economic and social injustice. So I think often the just transition, as it's called, you may have heard of it, or the fair transition, is conceived of as a means to kind of shave off maybe the unfair edges of an inevitable transition to net zero that we have to achieve. Our commission was built on the premise that actually, if we make the right policy choices, we can actually use the transition to make people's lives better and to reduce inequalities as well. And it was set up very much with the acknowledgement that we knew that decarbonisation was moving into a new phase. So from one that was conducted in the background, achieved by reducing emissions in the power sector, to one that touches on people's everyday lives. And as we all know, we've got to change the way we heat our homes and how we get around, what we eat, and for some, the work they do. But the crucial message of our report was that this is also an opportunity to improve people's quality of life. So while many people, like sort of environmentalists in particular, talk about the kind of co-benefits of the transition, the co-benefits of moving to net zero, the citizens we spoke to as part of our commission just spoke about the benefits, the new jobs, the chance to improve people's health and well-being and tackle poverty as well. And what we heard as part of the commission from people in communities right across the country was that this transition, this transformation, if you like, must be rooted in fairness. Now, this isn't just, as one of our questioners, Sagar, has intimated, it's not just because people in the poorest communities are least responsible for these crises and invariably the worst affected, but also because unless, and this was one of the central arguments of the Commission, was that unless this transition is rooted in fairness, it simply won't succeed. As our chairs said, the public have a veto on net zero, and they will wield it if the transition isn't fair and bring it to a swift halt. A big part of the Commission's work, we wanted to do something differently. We wanted to make sure that the voices of communities from across the UK shaped the recommendations put forward in the report. So that meant going out and listening to communities that were going to be particularly affected by the transition. So the Commission ran citizens' juries in places confronted with particular risks and opportunities in the face of accelerating action on climate and nature, areas where workers will need to move away from carbon-intensive industries to greener jobs, rural communities locked out of job opportunities and into car dependency, an industrialised part of the commuter belt facing developments of roads and houses, that's sort of Thurrock, areas with incredible natural assets and the local potential to tackle these crises with the right support. So we went to 4 places in the UK, Tees Valley and County Durham, the South Wales Valleys, Thurrock and Aberdeenshire, and we brought together groups of around 20 people, representative of their area with a range of views and backgrounds, to discuss what they think fair action would look like in tackling the climate and nature emergencies. And they heard from experts on the potential solutions, but we also recognise that they are experts too, experts in what it's like to live in their communities, experts in what fairness means to them. And our recommendations and all of our work really subsequent to the Commission is built on their kind of ambitious, optimistic and thorough recommendations, and they shaped the final report of the Commission, which I was going to talk a bit about today. I think whilst the recommendations from the jurors were in many ways specific to where they live, there were really big themes that emerged from all of the groups, and we drew on these to develop the 6 shifts that we present at the top of the report. These are really 6 shifts in the UK's approach to net zero, which we think should be adopted from whether you're talking about reform of the energy market and people's energy bills, whether you're talking about people's pensions and how you ensure that you green them, whether you're talking about industrial strategy and industrial policy to reduce industrial emissions. These are ways that we've got to think about changing the way we operate and the way in which government does policy to ensure there is a genuinely fair transition. So first of all, the idea that we need to move from this just being a problem to be mitigated, as frightening and consequential the climate crisis is in terms of the impact it's going to have on people's lives, both here but particularly around the world, including the global south. The people we spoke to wanted to see and argue that actually it needed to be about more than staving off the worst. It can be about making life better for people, particularly people who've been historically missed out or left behind. Secondly, that we need to move from this idea that fairness is some kind of afterthought, that you design environmental or climate policy and then you think about fairness at the end. Actually, fairness has got to be foundational. We've got to think about the fairness implications of climate policies at the very beginning. Without it, the transition won't be fair, and neither will it be seen to be fair. That kind of relates to the next point about being done, not policy not being done to people, but actually being done with and by people. We increase fairness when we involve people in the decisions that affect them. people who know how these decisions will really play out. The idea that we've got to move from individuals and silos to a whole economy and all society approach. They wanted every part of the economy and society to be involved in the transition if it's going to be a success. People wanted a partnership between government, business, workers, civil society and the public. They were clear that this certainly can't be down to individual responsibility. I think our previous speaker pointed to that. You can't expect individual pension holders necessarily, while everyone has a particular responsibility within their own lives. You can't expect individuals to know every aspect of the products. You need to ensure that government is working with business and others to ensure that the regulations are in place, so they know that when they say it's green, it really is green, both from a climate perspective, both from a environmental perspective, but also from a people's perspective, a workers' perspective as well. People were clear that also we need to move from top-down policy making to kind of national leadership and local ownership and delivery, as they called it. They want to see strong leadership from government, but there also needs to be local ownership and empowerment to deliver the solutions that work on the ground. One quote was, sharing power isn't a kind of zero-sum game. And lastly, all of our jurors talked about the importance of nature. And it was something that they felt that it just isn't sufficiently reflected in the national conversation or in our policy making. So we know that the UK is one of the most depleted countries in the world, and our destruction of nature is actively accelerating global heating. But we also know that its repair can help to address this. And we can't continue to have separate conversations about climate and nature. Achieving net zero on its own is not enough. And I think this really does speak to the question asked in the previous section, which is we can't have an approach that just focuses on bearing down on emissions if one of the impacts of that is the over extraction of other resources like lithium and other things towards electric vehicles, for example, that then has huge environmental impacts or potentially disastrous labour impacts as well. We need to think about these things together. So together, these 6 shifts underpin the new social contracts, which is outlined in our report, a social contract for a fair transition, 6 principles responding to the 6 shifts needed. I'm just going to take you through that social contract now and what we think that looks like in policy terms. So first of all, this report responds to the first shift there around it being an opportunity to be seized. So we call for a people's dividend, a guarantee that people right across the country will benefit from the transition, with the greatest return accruing to those who need it most. After all, we know that done right, the benefits of ambitious action are substantial for both the public and the environment, from the creation of decent jobs to lower energy bills, as we've heard from other speakers, and significant public health benefits to thriving wildlife and a healthier planet. But policy does need to be purposefully designed to deliver these benefits. They're not going to happen by chance. So we recommend, as part of this, the idea that the government should commit to potentially free local transport, or at least subsidised at the point of use by 2030. The idea of a creation of a direct dividend payments to the public through revenue raised from carbon pricing, and the expansion of schemes for community ownership, just some of the examples that are in the report. Secondly, the Commission proposes a fairness lock on every single climate and nature policy to ensure that fairness is at the heart of everything we do. As our jurors in the South Wales Valleys told us, the cost of change, both financial and in how we live, has to be shared fairly. And this is what we heard time and again from our jurors across the country. And that means that the cost of all policies must be fairly assessed. Those on lower incomes must not lose out, they must benefit. And one of the big things about that was they said support must be put in place ahead of change. They can't see their lives restricted without government, businesses and others making sure that they have more sustainable options. A really good example is transport, and the need to ensure that there is strong, affordable public transport options in every part of the country if we're to persuade people to drive less and use their car less. And we've got to put in place mechanisms to ensure we're taking decisions not just for now but future generations as well. And as part of this, we argue that the UK must make a fair contribution internationally as well. So what does that look like in practice? We propose a new large, what we call a Green Go scheme, which is to offer grants and loans through high street banks for insulating homes, installing low carbon heating systems, and supporting the purchase of things like e-bikes and electric vehicles for those that need them. We need to move away from this siloed approach where there's a grant over there, there's a grant over here, which most of the public find it incredibly difficult to navigate. One big branded scheme backed by government, available on every high street to support the transition. We also call for to support workers in carbon intensive industries, a fully funded right to retrain. And lastly, we call for the UK to make a greater and fairer contribution to addressing the climate and nature crisis, internationally consummate with its international and historic contribution. Next, a people first approach. We heard, and I don't think this just, it extends to climate policy. We heard time and time again from jurors around the country that they want the public, that they want to be part of this transition. They want to be part of policy making. They want change brought about with or by them, not done to them. So they and the Commission, as a result, call for the public to have a clear role in the creation of climate and nature plans, including through permanent national citizens' assemblies for climate and nature deliberation, local citizens' juries, and a leading role for the public in local plans as well. For us, that also means providing clear and accessible information about the transition through a public communications plan and a one-stop shop for support, information and guidance. And our jurors said they wanted to see a public communications plan similar to the one for COVID in recognition of the scale of the threat posed and the change we need to see. This doesn't necessarily mean a daily briefing at 5 o'clock in Downing Street, but it does mean clear communications to the public with some press conferences like that, maybe on a more regular basis, but clear communication campaigns about what people can do, what support is on offer, that really is able to provide the information so we can accelerate the transition. Next, national leadership and local delivery. As our jurors in Tees Valley and County Durham said to us, a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to work. We've got to recognise that different areas within the UK have different challenges, assets and opportunities. Designing policies with local circumstances in mind through passing powers down to combined and local authorities and local communities, both in our view, but also the view of our jurors, can help achieve better and fairer outcomes. So we call for the government to hold far greater powers over the economy, transport and planning. And in doing so, local areas will be able to shape and deliver their own responses, allowing for more ambition, policy and innovation and popular support for the transition as well. Next, a whole economy, all society approach. Really behind this is the idea that government needs to be joined up. Every policy must be a climate and nature policy. So we call for a net zero and fair transition delivery body to drive change across government, and a new net zero and nature rule for all government spending and policy decisions. All policies and programmes and investment must be compliant with our collective climate and nature goals. But the public also wanted to see government join forces with businesses, large and small, trade unions and workers, and the whole of civil society to tackle this challenge. So our jurors recognise the innovation and job creating potential of the private sector, particularly small to medium sized enterprise, and they wanted it to be harnessed to help us achieve our goals. So we propose that the government provides an enabling environment through tax incentives, small business loans and regulation. But while our jurors wanted to see businesses who were doing the right thing rewarded, they also wanted to see those who weren't, the laggards, penalised. They wanted to see a polluter pays approach applied more uniformly across the economy. This is my second to last slide, not quite sure how I'm doing on time. But I think finally the priority and the value that our jurors put on the preservation and restoration of and access to nature was hugely striking, and their message was overwhelming. They felt that it is more than past time that nature is put on the same footing as climate, and this isn't something that's currently reflected in our national conversation. So the Commission calls for the creation of a National Recovery Committee, similar legally binding targets for the environment, and a new National Nature Service. We also back the call of our jurors from Tees Valley and County Durham for the creation of what they called an Attenborough Scholarship, which is opportunities offered for young people to start careers in restoring nature alongside other low carbon jobs. We also called for the rest of the UK to follow the lead of the Welsh Government to pass a Wellbeing and Future Generations Act and to embed wellbeing measures into the heart of all government decision making, moving beyond GDP as the sole measure of success. Finally, the report contains many policy recommendations from free or subsidised local public transport funding and incentives to help people make green choices in their everyday lives, support and a right to retrain for workers who have to move away from polluting jobs, paid work and training opportunities and a national nature service, greater involvement in decision making, a fair share approach to global emissions and reductions. Please do look at the report for further details. The recommendations cover everything from 20-minute neighbourhoods to how we heat our homes, to the role of farmers in looking after the land, to fairer access to green spaces. But what underpins all of these is the unifying idea that through action on climate and nature, there is an opportunity to improve people's quality of life, to create new jobs, improve people's health and well-being, and increase fairness. And it's founded on the ideas about fairness and opportunity. Put simply, the crises we are facing are urgent, and tackling them will not work if it is not done fairly. We will not take people with us. The fair transition and the idea of a fair transition is not just the idea that it's something that's morally right. We believe that there are huge opportunities to be seized through the transition, and in doing so, we can also maintain the significant public support we have for the transition, and indeed build it with longevity for the long transition that we face over the coming years. And I think just the kind of final thing to say is, I think in many ways the argument, and I think we're going to hear a bit more from Johnny potentially about this, in terms of the energy crisis, is really this issue of fairness in the transition is really playing out now. And this is what I think our work really does speak to, is that actually the low carbon option, the climate option, the nature option, for so long was seen as something that was somehow a burden, somehow an extra cost. Actually, whether it's onshore wind or home insulation, it is actually providing the means both to reduce our emissions, but also reduce our energy bills. Actually, the low carbon option is increasingly the option to provide huge opportunities in our economy in terms of job creation, but also alleviate cost of living issues as well. So yeah, I mean, while the report came out last year, it's obviously still very timely. And I will stop there. I've spoken more than enough, and I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks very much.
Luke, that was super comprehensive, detailed, but right on time. So thank you for that. And I'm not sure if it's your presentation in particular, or whether people have had time to warm up now, but it's prompted quite a few questions and comments in the chat. I think what we'll do is we will take a note of those, and then we'll use them, I think, for our panel discussion later on. But that last point that you just made about sort of low carbon options now not just being good for the sort of macroeconomic situation, but households in particular through reducing living costs and energy bills is a really important one. And I think I'd like sort of you and the rest of the panel to think about that in terms of how the low carbon option might play a role in increasing sort of household financial resilience as well. So if we talk about sort of the move towards green options for insulating homes, for instance, and even sort of this option of being able to sort of pay back to the grid, and how that then can create a bit of a financial buffer, which enables people to weather the storm of peaks and troughs in energy bills and so on further down the line. So unless there are any other questions outside of those in the chat, then I think what we'll do is we'll go for a break, and let me just check the time. Right on time. So perhaps what we'll do is we will start promptly at 2:45. So that's given us a tiny bit extra for a break. But yeah, back here and start promptly at 2:45 for our final presentation from Johnny at Resolution Foundation, and then our international perspective, and then our panel discussion. Thanks, everyone. Almost promptly, 1:45, not quite. Okay, so we've got our last presentation now, and that's from Johnny Marshall at Resolution Foundation. So if you're there, Johnny, you want to start sharing your screen. There he is.
Right. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me along today. My name is Johnny Marshall. I work at the Resolution Foundation. I generally deal with anything to do with energy or net zero, which has been quite a busy few months, I guess. But it means we've got a decent amount of stuff to talk about today. For those that don't know, the Resolution Foundation, we are an independent think tank that works to improve the living standards of households on low and middle incomes. So that's not those in the very depths of poverty. It's those that were once I guess known in political parlance as the just about managings. And it's generally people who are, as our founder likes to call it, like one broken down car or one sort of like broken boiler away from being in a right mess financially. And we work in a, we work in a way that's quite analytically focused. We do a lot of our own research, and I'm going to talk you through some of that today, specifically around what's been happening with energy bills, how that has been impacting living standards of different types of people over the past few months, what the government has done about it, and finally how some aspects of the net zero transition could be used to reduce the impact of energy bills on people's lives going forwards. So, a quick summary of what I'm going to go over today. I'm going to talk about energy bills being a key driver of the cost of living squeeze we're seeing at the moment, and will likely see continue for at least the foreseeable future. At the moment, the typical energy bill, that's for a household on the default price cap tariff, is just under £2,000 a year, £1,970 a year, up from an average of about £1,100 since the price cap came into effect for everybody, not just prepaid meters, in 2018. But this is only the sort of start of a real sort of energy crisis. There's a forecast that the next price cap is going to be £2,800, £3,000 during the winter. And this is going to be at a time when households have been paying the unaffordable levels for energy now for about 6 months. The effects of this haven't really filtered through into to the wider economy yet. People have only had a couple to 2, 3 of these high energy bills. That it's not been, the effects aren't really in full swing yet, but it's going to get even worse coming into the winter. When more people are in arrears and more general pressure around the cost of living has built. All this cheery scenario comes against a backdrop where we have the highest inflation for about 40 years. It's forecast to continue rising, and we are living through a period of continued falls in real income. So what the government has done, the government's interviewed 3 times to try and assuage the impact of high energy costs. It intervened in February through the spring statement, and again at the end of May, and we're just going to run through the impacts of these on people of different incomes. But the top line is that eventually, after all 3 of these interventions, the government has largely got it right. Most of the impacts of high energy bills faced by lower income households has largely been abated, at least for now. And then the final part of what we're going to talk about is the if assuming there's no extra spike in energy costs over the next winter, the government has a bit of time now to start looking at sort of systemic changes that we need to ensure that energy bills stay lower for longer. And there's 2 ways of doing that. There's making energy cheaper, and there's using less of it. And I'm going to talk through some of the implications of improving our building stock so that we use less energy, and some of the challenges that come with it. Because it's very easy to say insulate houses and bills will be lower, but there's 15-20 million houses across the country that need upgrading. We're not doing anything at the moment, and it's not the cheapest thing to do. So it comes with its own set of challenges. So this is where we are in terms of energy bills. So since the introduction of the price cap in 2018, the typical bill has averaged about £1,100 a year. Last summer it went up. No, last winter. Last October it went up by £140, which is an increase of more than 10%, which at the time was seen as quite big news, quite a move. But since then, it's been in absolutely unprecedented territory. Energy bills at the moment are nearly £2,000 a year for household that uses the typical amount of energy. Of course, different people use different amounts, and it's forecast to get even higher. Ofgem said it was going to be £2,800 in its little warning a couple of weeks ago, and then we've seen recent forecasts of it hitting £3,000, which is, this is going to be completely unaffordable. There's also talk about making the price cap quarterly, which will have positive and negative impacts on living standards. It will mean that it's easier to bring in support measures because they'll last for shorter periods of time, so they won't cost the government as much money, so they'll be more willing to do things to help. But it also increases the risk of particularly sharp spikes, which is a real sort of worry for the first quarter of each year, when sort of energy prices, energy markets are at their highest, and the sort of risk of volatility from where we are now, looking at sort of, well, trying to look at the geopolitical situation, is also the highest. Now, I mentioned backdrop of inflation. So inflation is high at the moment. Things are getting more expensive. Everyone notices this, but inflation is higher for lower income households. So this was based on the April inflation. Obviously, inflation has crept up since then, and it shows that the poorest families are facing a rate of inflation that's 1.5 percentage points higher than the richest. And if the forecasts of the October price cap do come to pass, this difference could increase to 6%, which would be, by far the largest on record. This sort of different way that inflation interacts with different households is getting some more attention. Jack Monroe, the campaigner, the chef and campaigner, is doing a great job of drawing it to light. But this is the sort of situation where you can sort of see the government is really going to have to do something to help. And ONS surveys have found that about a third of households, families at the moment, are responding to high inflation by cutting back on essentials, which is a pretty dark situation to be in. So back to energy bills. So when the first big energy bill rise came through in last October, we at Resolution Foundation start talking about households being in fuel stress. That's where they spend more than 10% of incomes on energy bills. This is the sort of the old-fashioned way of talking about fuel poverty. How we measure fuel poverty, at least in England, has changed a couple of times over the years, and those changes have generally meant that fewer people are in fuel poverty with each change. So instead of solving the problem, it just changes the definition. So we've sort of stuck to our guns and stuck with the original one. And before with the expectation that energy bills were going to hit £2,800 this winter, it looked like about 4 in 10 of all households across the country were going to be in fuel stress, or spending 10% of incomes on their energy bills. And this number is basically too big to respond to in policy terms. It's too much money, too many people, too big a challenge. So in terms of looking at where this is a real issue, we then sort of worked out what it meant for households in severe fuel stress, which is spending a fifth of budgets on energy bills. And this is where decisions that are completely unimaginable to most of us, most people on this call, on this webinar, would be made. This is where energy bills mean meals are skipped, where people are cold. It's where real misery sets in. And this chart shows that the likelihood of facing this sort of grim reality from energy bills is much more likely to be in this position if you're on a lower income. So this is where support should be targeted. More than 3/4 of all households that would have been in severe fuel stress measure, had the government not intervened in May, would have been in the bottom 3 income deciles. And these are people that do not have the same sort of coping mechanisms as richer households. People have low incomes, lower savings. So about 2/3 of the poorest fifth of households have less than a month's income saved away. So whereas a richer household can either just ignore high energy costs, or can dip into savings, or cut back on spending on meals out and pubs and holidays, these aren't options for low-income households, which is why the government sort of really needed to act. And this is sort of a chart of how we think various things the government has done and could have done or have played out. So at the very top there the blue lines on this chart show the share of the support that goes to the poorest half of the population, and the red lines show that going to the poorest fifth of the population. So this for something to be a progressive intervention, you're looking for these to be as high as possible, so as much money goes to those who need it the most. So if you run through the sort of 3 attempts the government's done, first up was the universal payment. So this fits into the energy bill support scheme where everyone got the same amount of money. So this is half the money goes to the poorest half, a fifth of the money goes to the poorest fifth. It's a political choice to do this, to give everyone money rather than tailoring it. But on top of that, the government also intervened through a council tax rebate. And what we figured out is that this wasn't a whole load better than just a universal approach, and it also had some sort of strange cliff edges as well, because with council taxes being based on property values, it meant that you're much less likely to get it if you lived in a city or in the southeast than you're in the north. That's regardless of your incomes or your wealth or your ability to cope with higher bills. The top bar on this chart, the top bar on this chart here shows the distributional impact of the most recent intervention, or the lion's share of the most recent intervention, which is £650 support through for households on mean tested benefits. And you can see the vast majority of this goes to people in the bottom half of the income spectrum. So this is much better. Another thing we can learn from this is that the sort of calls from some within society to use tax cuts, for example, to help with the cost of living aren't a particularly great way of doing this. So, we would always back more support through the benefit system. Britain has a way of getting money to low-income households, and if the problem is low-income households not having enough money, the obvious way of doing that is through the benefit system rather than through tax. A couple more on energy bills, when how the government's done. So this chart here shows the distributional impact of each of the 3 interventions. It's best to ignore the very poorest quintile here. There's issues in the data in terms of incomes, but you can sort of see from the rest of it that the first intervention in February was largely flat across the income spectrum. Everyone got about the same amount of money. The spring statement, which was widely criticised, had much more of the benefits of it going to wealthy households than to poor households, which at a time when poor households are feeling the brunt of rising costs more than richer households is an interesting approach. But then we can see from the green bars here that this has largely been compensated for during May's package, which was very generous. It was upwards of £15 billion when most people were sort of asking for a bit less than that, which is good. And it was well targeted. You can see that people at the very bottom end of the income spectrum received a lot more support from those at the top, and this is a really good way of seeing that the government actually engaged what the problem was here, the issues that low and middle income households are facing, and intervened in a way to help out. And then this one just shows how much of the increase of energy bills has been offset by these interventions. So again, if you ignore the very first one, the first quintile on here, you can see that for the poorest households, almost all of the increased cost of energy has been abated through government interventions, and this fades away to just over half of the increased costs for higher earners. And this is very progressive policy making. It's just a shame it took a long time to get there. Of course, inflation is coming through from other places. It's not just energy bills. Energy feeds through into other input costs, which are yet to filter through into inflation. We're going to see higher costs of just stuff, higher costs of food. And there's also effects of the continued decline in the value of the pound, which means imported stuff from overseas becomes more expensive, which again will feed through into inflation. And then finally, the recent and ongoing spike in petrol and diesel costs, which have yet to filter through. But despite all that, hopefully these charts show that through its May package in particular, that adding the cumulative impact of all 3 together, we think that the government has largely bought itself a bit of time now. And as such, we should be starting to look at the ways in which energy bills can be kept low and affordable for as long as possible, and for as many people as possible. So the first way of doing this is, there's obviously 2 ways of doing this: making energy bills lower, and I'm going to talk about the potential of making energy bills lower by using less energy at home if our homes were more efficient. Energy bills are, of course, a function of both the amount of energy we use and the price of energy. There are loads of ways of making energy cheaper. but as has been said already today, these lodges sit like away from the household. These building power stations and wind farms and reforming grid codes and stuff isn't things that families get involved with, whereas insulating houses is something that will impact a lot of us over the next decade or two, as we have to do it to all of our homes. So what this chart shows is that the vast majority of households in the that would have been in severe fuel stress, or would have been spending a fifth of their total family budgets on energy bills this winter, had May's package not been delivered, lived in homes which fall below the standard the government has set for 2035, and this is to be rated C or higher on the EPC scale. And this chart sort of shows clearly what the problem is. There are various figures for how much different homes consume. There's lots of ways of measuring it, seemingly, but from the EPC register, which is like a list of energy data from 22 million houses across the country, you'll see that a D-rated home uses about a quarter more gas to stay warm than a C-rated home, and an E-rated home uses about half extra. So this is the clear way that clear way to bring down bills. But despite what seems like a bit of an obvious solution, we are making a bit of a hash of it. This chart is if you spend a lot of time on Twitter, which I unfortunately do, you'll have seen lots of people tweeting out this chart in outrage. This is from the CCC's, the Climate Change Committee's 2021 progress report, and it shows that due to policy decisions made in the early 2010s, we largely stopped insulating the building stock. There are a couple of changes to policy that did it. Obviously, there's a removal of funding, which gets a lot of the attention. But the second major driver, in our opinion at least, was a change in the shape of the policy. So before 2012, you had obligations on various actors within the energy sector to deliver insulation in houses. These were on network companies, on energy companies, and if they didn't do it, they would get penalised by government. And this meant that people were offered insulation and were sort of encouraged to uptake it so that these targets were met. That changed. We moved away from these obligation-based models to a more voluntary system, largely through the Green Deal. And this meant that as well as a lack of support, there was a lack of impetus to insulate houses. And this means that we are now well below the rate that we need to be insulating houses at to meet our emissions targets, but also crucially at the moment that millions of households are paying more for energy bills than they need to. The government's tried since then to do something on insulation. It's tried the Green Deal, which failed for a number of reasons, but I guess the main one was that it involved a loan with an interest rate of about 7%, which was higher than you could get from a bank, which you could spend on whatever you want. So people didn't take it up. And then obviously there's the sort of mid-pandemic fiasco of the Green Homes Grant, which has been sort of debated enough recently, but there's many reasons why that failed as well. But this means that now we're in a situation where we need to get about 40 million bits of insulation, so that's roof insulation, wall insulation, windows, for example, into 15 to 20 million houses over the next 13 years. And this is largely from a standing start. We have no policies, we have no enthusiasm for government, we have very little public awareness and public demand, and we have no, a very small industry to actually deliver it. And this is another one of the sort of key challenges that this brings, that the insulation sort of challenge brings, and this is how to make it available and affordable to people who don't have much money. So this chart shows that that leaky houses, so wall insulation is the hardest bit, it's the most expensive, it's the most disruptive. This shows that that across the poorest fifth of the population, badly insulated walls are very common. They're common across tenures, but they're also common across the country to different extents. And this brings a big sort of issue in terms of how do we design policy that makes upfront costs affordable for people who have low incomes, low levels of savings, but will benefit the most. how to do this in a way where state cash that is basically being funded to improve private assets is done in a fair way, and how to make sure that it's done properly, so it's not rushed, so that the efficiency savings on offer actually come to pass, which again is another issue that's sort of been the case around British efficiency policy in recent years, that the sort of targets haven't, well, the effects of insulation hasn't really been measured. There's been no follow-up surveys, there's been no follow-up work to see how much energy is actually falling. And then the final point is that, of course, there's the private rented sector. How do we get people to invest in their homes when they don't live in them? That's a big challenge. There are supposedly regulations coming to make sure that homes have to be a certain efficiency rating to be let, but these have been coming for a long time, and they're supposed to be starting quite soon, but there's no sign of them yet. This is just a sort of outline of how we're starting to think about insulating houses at RF. We've got a note coming out on this in probably about a month, maybe 4 weeks or so. So there'll be a lot more from us on insulation there. So just to wrap up, high energy bills are hitting low-income families the hardest, hitting us all, but low-income families the hardest, and there's a danger they could be here to stay. And there's no sign of energy cost abating on the futures market. After 3 attempts, the government finally got it right on helping poorer households with unaffordable energy costs. And this, the third point, is now this sort of the immediate crisis is paused, or at least sort of partially assuaged. We should be looking at longer term solutions, which need to be centered around making the energy we use at home cheaper and using less of it. And this is particularly important for poorer households who won't be able to, to figure out how to make this accessible to people who can't afford to insulate their own homes. That's it from me. There's my email address. If you want to get in touch, please do so. Thanks.
Some sobering, shocking statistics there, which I'm sure everyone is frantically tweeting right now. So more tweets about that graph and about that chart and about those stats. We've got a question straight away. So a question from Anne, and then we're going to move on to Matt's response, and then to discussing all of this in far more detail in the panel discussion. So Anne, please go ahead.
Thank you. I was just curious, I'm doing a community research project at the moment in Bristol with low-income households around financial resilience. And housing has come up as a major theme, where people are describing how bad housing increases costs on the energy side, but also just because they have no space to store food. So they buy food in smaller quantities rather than bulk shopping, and things break more often because they have, several kids in one little room, etc. I was just curious, Johnny, in the survey or the research I'm doing right now, that's mostly council housing though. So people are renting and have no ownership or no way of insulating their homes and making them more energy efficient. Because you just talked about private renting, about ownership. Is that something you looked at in your statistics?
Yeah, so social housing is generally less bad than other types of housing, energy wise, because it's generally newer. There's more flats in social housing, and there has been efforts over the years from housing associations and other owners of social housing to actually insulate these homes. Generally because it's easier to do so. It's easier to insulate if you own a row of terraces and you can insulate it all at once. It's a lot easier than persuading 10 to 20 families that live in those to all do something at the same time. And this sort of plays out in the sort of policy response you're seeing at the moment. So there is a social housing decarbonisation fund that the government is running and is funding, and seems to be working middlingly well, I think, if that's a word. And as such, there's a clearer route to making social housing more efficient, or making social housing efficient enough. It's just a case of doing it in a way where the resources are there, where because housing associations are stretched, they'll need a dedicated person to work on decarbonising the housing stock, and that there is enough cash to pay for it. Whereas if you look back to the private rented sector, where there's no incentive at the moment for landlords to improve their homes, and if you look to the owner occupied sector, where the only improvements you generally see are through building regulations, which impacts wealthier people who are doing extensions, I guess, and that's the main sort of driver for performance upgrades in existing homes at the moment. So I'd say the problem in terms of getting to our targets, our emissions targets and our fuel poverty targets and bringing down bills is more acute in the owner-occupier sector and in the private rental sector.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Johnny. I think if there's any, unless there's any more questions, we'll go over to Matt. Is that okay? You take the floor.
That's wonderful. First of all, I just want to thank you all for wonderful presentations. Thank you, Louise, for organizing this, and the rest of CHASM for organizing this, because it's been a tremendous gift to me to hear just a range of different perspectives concerning issues that, frankly, we're not discussing currently in the U.S. So I'll start with some broad comments about from the U.S. perspective, what do these issues mean? And then specifically point out some things that I found particularly compelling about each of the presentations. So first of all, I love the approach to this topic. It's nicely framed around the concept of economic risk shifting, which we know over the past 40 years under the economic regime in which we're living has meant shifting risk from institutions onto individuals. And as you all are discussing today, how that then intersects with energy policy. Again, not a topic we're currently discussing in the US. It's very forward thinking to approach this and to specifically consider what's the financial pain that lower income households will disproportionately bear amidst net zero transitions. And from that perspective, I think it's really important to note, as Johnny just did, that we're already starting from a point of regressivity with respect to the proportion of income spent on energy among low-income households. And so there's this prospect of clean energy transitions further aggravating this regressivity. So the idea that, we have to first overcome the current regressivity we have to then, somehow transition to progressivity through transition. In the US, transportation is going to be a massive challenge for us. It's already a bit of a mess, and one of the reasons is that mass transit in the US is tremendously expensive to build. So there's been a real lag in public investments in public transit. It's going to be, to a certain degree, particularly because we're such a rural country, inevitable that we look at automobiles. The problem there, of course, is that in the private market, only higher income individuals are able to afford Teslas, and they're able to recoup a return on investment based on foregone petrol cost, thanks in part to plug-in energy at public access points. So they are literally pulling energy from public resources to fund their own gain. Anybody that drives a Tesla, thank you. So I'm just making a point around regressivity. And there's also a problem in the US around geospatial mismatch between work and residence, which is driven by a very inequitable housing market. And I'll mention in a moment other points of intersection with housing. It also occurred to me that risk, and I'm thinking of the comment that Sagar mentioned had earlier, that risk is multi-layered and geospatially distributed, and that we may be helping people, lower income people here in the UK or in the US, manage financial risk associated with transition. Yet if the sources of that new green energy is sourced with exploited labor in the global South, then we're simply transferring risk from north to south, which I think presents a pretty complex international policy challenge. So to go into some of the specific points, Carl, the concept of a poverty premium is a really compelling idea because it asserts that income redistribution via taxation in the social welfare state is not as efficient as we think, because we have to consider supply side arrangements. We have to consider the expense side of household income statements. And the issue of time poverty constraints and how much we can expect individuals, particularly lower income ones, to be involved as active market participants and make optimal decisions is problematic. And I think just, Carl, your organization, I have to say it's very notable that you all have a dual mission of advocacy and social investment. That's not something we see a whole lot of in US. And again, to go back to the poverty premium concept, I feel like what you articulated is further crystallized than what we discuss in the US. We tend to limit our discussion of that concept to high cost credit for the most part. Emma, I was really pleased to see a range of behavioral economic principles integrated into your work. We've done a series of field experiments over several years around tax refund saving, incorporating behavioral interventions. So a lot of that sounded very familiar and refreshing. I wonder if there may be an issue with which or to explore an issue around how individuals process information where they may be making active trade-offs between financial returns and social returns. So is there a way to potentially, at least hypothetically, model how an investment in Fund A would produce a return 2 percentage points lower than Fund B, yet the social return, however that's measured and articulated, at least hypothetically, could be 20 percentage points higher for Fund A. Does that sort of calculus kind of drive people's investment decisions? But in terms of scale, I wonder how much those types of messaging, how that could be applied to institutional investors. A running joke in the US is that Harvard University is a hedge fund with a university on the side. Is it possible that constituents of institutional investors can be reached to exert influence at larger scale? Particularly if you think about private universities, there's already a critical mass, presumably, of constituents that are concerned about climate. Luke, I love the exploration of this concept of fairness. It's such a, it's one of those concepts that we can easily take for granted. It's so central to devising solutions to transition, but it needs to be interrogated. How is fairness defined? What are the subordinate principles driving it? And to what degree do those principles vary by different levels of social and economic privilege? So having explored that in different communities and with different individuals, I think was really compelling. The other thing that really struck me is how important it is to be transparent about how change comes with costs. It seems to be this is an important starting point. If we're going to get to a point of fair distribution of risk, we have to start with the acknowledgement collectively that there are going to be costs borne by this transition. In the US, unfortunately, we have these two competing ideologies, one in which acknowledges the need for and cost of change, and not just with respect to climate change, but also structural racism. And then a competing ideology that absolutely denies the need for change, and hence any consideration of cost, whereas any talk of cost is a source of imposition on individual freedom. So, a little reference to our historic relationship between our countries and our displaced fascination with freedom amidst public issues and concerns. Johnny, I really appreciated the proactive perspective that hardship prevented is superior to hardship mitigated on the back end. The intersections with housing policy, your findings around insulation, the affordability of new housing that meets higher environmental standards in addition to remediation, the idea of home energy as a component of safe housing and how it is protective with respect to health outcomes. You think about the increased risk of heat stroke among the elderly in homes without air conditioning, other health issues impacted by colder heat, refrigerating medications like insulin for people with chronic health conditions, or powering assistive devices. Concept of the people's dividend is very compelling. It tracks really well with the concept of the freedom dividend that presidential candidate Andrew Yang popularized, and has led to a lot of experimentation around basic income in the US. Just lastly, it was really notable how important it is to monitor the distributional data on cost and subsidies with respect to energy. And that kind of links back to my starting point about how we're starting from that point of regressivity. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, for your very, very insightful, carefully considered and thoughtful response to all of those presentations, and to really get into the heart of the issue of each one of those. And I've written a lot of things down there that have given me food for thought that I think we'd definitely like to pick up on and discuss a bit further during the panel discussion. So thanks again. I think I'm gonna switch here, unless we can pan effectively to Adele.
I think we can pan.
Okay. So yeah, over to Adele.
Like I'm not quite looking in the right direction.
To chair this, and I'm going to try and keep an eye on the chat, I think, but to do that I'll need to.
Well, thank you to all of our speakers. Thank you to Matt. So many amazing ideas. I'm not going to try and summarize them again, because Matt's done an absolutely fantastic job of doing that. But really what I'd like to do now is to try to consolidate everything that we've learned and take it forward from a research perspective. So first of all, I'd just like to ask the speakers a little bit about data and evidence that they feel is absolutely essential now to identify where there are signs of distress and possibly solutions that could be implemented quickly. So do you feel that there is some missing evidence that could really help to identify where the most vulnerable consumers are facing difficulties? Or do you think that data is already in place and there's sufficient evidence going forward? And I can see speakers, but I can see everybody else as well. So if you'd like to respond, please put your hand up. Okay, Carl, please.
I said during my presentation actually that what gets measured gets done, and that's something we say a lot. Is I don't think it's original. I think it's been said before, but I mean the principle behind that is that often when we're dealing with difficult, complex concepts, to be able to win, to get on side government, regulators, different stakeholders, it needs to be very clear and obvious to them what the problem is and what the forthcoming solution is. Now, with something like energy poverty per se, without talking too far out of place, this hasn't been the easiest government to work with on trying to look at those particular issues. So we're already at a disadvantage, but the advantageous position would be to have perfectly good data on poverty, on the poverty premium, such that at least the problem or the issue is as clear as day. And it's kind of a special plea because one regulatory body, the Competition and Markets Authority, in 2018 did actually commit to carrying out their own measure of the poverty premium on a year-by-year basis, one that would have been advantaged again by access to business level data, not just self-reported data on costs and spending. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. It was shelved, and then there was a pandemic. So there is a bit of an excuse, but it would be great to see some of that returned. And the short answer to your question is that there's not enough data, and there's always room to increase the stock of data that we have. And that would be a good example of it. It would certainly cut across all the issues that I think the panelists and the commenters in the comment section have talked about today.
Thank you very much. I think one of the things that struck me when Matt mentioned the the problem of air conditioning in the US, and obviously for us it's more often a problem of heating, but not only these days. And the changing environment means that we do have extreme temperatures in both directions. But it struck me that one of the things we don't know very much about is how much time people spend at home. And obviously those people who are less employed spend more time at home, whether that's through sickness or unemployment or caring responsibilities. And so we have a really complex need for data about what's happening during the day for those people and the cost of maintaining their home in that time. If I could move to Johnny, I think next, please.
So one of the issues we have with the data is just the sort of the delay that it all involves. A lot of the work to make published data from ONS or other sort of micro data sources we use relevant involves a lot of wrangling in-house to make it so. And this means that you're coming from a position where it's really tricky to capture what's happening at this very moment, because if you look at spending data from a year or two ago, which is probably the most recent available, it's very hard to then account for how that spending profile will change if a lot more money is taken up on energy bills, for example. You can say, oh, look, how much more is going to be spent on energy bills. But it's very hard to see what is then sacrificed, what spending is then curtailed in response. And it's hard to know what the sort of solution to this is as well, because there's obviously, there's sort of polling data, YouGov data, but that's often a bit self-selecting. And then there's data from organizations such as Citizens Advice, people that go on their website and fill in their forms, which is again, useful, but doesn't cover the whole nation. So it's really hard to get a big picture. So that's a sort of data problems we're having. And one thing that I think would have been very useful would be around being able to use data, being able to access data from energy companies in the same way you can access sensitive data through sort of secure means, but through the ONS, for example. You can't do that for energy data that energy companies have, and you also can't do that for sort of smart meter data, which would be really useful as well. And there's provisions and rules to make sure you can use data that identifies individual people in a way that is responsible, and that your published work won't have any signs of who these people are on it. But to expand that to a sort of more I guess commercial type of data source would be really useful.
It's interesting you've both mentioned supply side data. So often we talk about how much we need to know about the consumer, but actually it seems that the gap may also be in having timely information, which could come almost immediately if it came from suppliers.
If you did it through smart meters, though, that would be half hourly demand data, which would be incredibly useful.
That's true. Yeah. Okay, Luke, please. I'd like to hear your thoughts as well.
I was going to make a similar point to Johnny, actually, on the kind of energy data. I think it's interesting actually that suppliers like Octopus are setting up all. I don't know whether you'd call it a think tank for the kind of Centre for Net Zero, I think they've called it, which is actually seeking to kind of operationalise their data in that way and make it more available. But obviously, it'd be great if other energy providers were doing the same, and that was made available to other researchers. So I totally would agree with that point. One thing that we're looking at the moment is trying to get under the bonnet where we think just more data and understanding is needed, is around like the components of inflation and looking at the drivers of inflation and the role of energy costs within that, and whatever sector you're looking at. So trying to understand how it's driving food prices, and how that relates to distribution impacts. And the reason I make that point is because there's obviously a lot of claims, which is at the heart of our work, around the idea that climate and nature policies are somehow adding costs to people's cost of living, when actually a lot of the data demonstrates that otherwise. But there's definitely a need for greater analysis just to understand the drivers of inflation, particularly with regard to energy. And I think that relates to a second point, which is about scenarios. So when we're thinking about emissions pathways, I think there's not enough understanding, and this, for example, I'd take transport as an example. We're working up a project on this, of like the economic and social benefits, particularly to those on lower incomes, alternative net zero pathways. So there is, just as an example on transport, we are heading towards a kind of fairly car dominant approach. Can understand to a certain extent why it might be quicker, as it were, to kind of have an EV electric vehicle dominant approach, but actually there are huge economic and social benefits to have a far bigger focus on active travel and on public transport. And yet I don't think there's been sufficient analysis either on the emission side or the economic and social indicator side of the kind of benefits of that approach. So there's kind of there's big data gaps there on kind of on different pathways that could deliver more economically and socially beneficial outcomes than the kind of ones that are kind of focused on by the CCC, although obviously their contribution is massive and welcome. The final point I was going to say is that on all of these issues, evidence and data alone isn't enough, and our work shows that, like the salience of an issue, the advocacy around it, and people's voice of representation are also crucial as well. Like just providing more data, it might improve the evidence, it might improve the policy solutions. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be taken up. So evidence alone, we would say, isn't enough.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good point. I'm thinking that I may just actually turn to the chat because it's looking incredibly large, and I've got absolutely no idea if people have burning points. So.
Adele, that last point is a good one and connects to Sagar's point. It's essentially, how do we transition to fossil fuels?
You may as well speak. Teresa's going to say.
No, I've just been keeping an eye on the chat, but no, I just think that last point that Rajesh raises, which is, how do some communities, those in the developing world, how do they survive essentially without fossil fuels? And there's a question there which connects to a number of Sagar's questions essentially, which is about thinking much more broadly about who this affects, and that perhaps the focus is a little Western centric and not sufficiently diverse in its approach.
Luke. Yes, please, Luke.
I mean, this is in part some of the work we've looked at in our environmental breakdown work, and also the work of the Commission. And I mean, I think you saw this at COP26, which is countries like the UK and other developed countries have made huge gains off the back of fossil fuels, and obviously have been the biggest historic and international contributors. That has to be recognized to climate change and make destruction of the wider environment. I think that's got to be recognised, and it's not enough just to expect every country to reduce fossil fuel reliance at the same pace. And I think it is incumbent on countries like the UK and others, through technological transfers, through living up to the responsibilities that they've made at previous COPs around, like the 100 billion, for example, that has been made since Copenhagen and before, to support developing countries and countries in the global south to develop. The truth is, they're not going to be able to do it. Communities aren't going to be doing it without the sufficient support, investment, money, technological transfers, etc. And also that's got to be done in a non-extractive way, in a way which is on fair terms. And I think I would say that we are quite a way away from that.
These are very difficult topics, and it really highlights just what a broad area it is, and how important it is that we bring people together with experience from different sectors, and including research, but not only research. It brings me to one of my questions, which is, do you think that there are stakeholders that are missing from the table? Are there particular organizations that you would like to have more interaction with, and to be able to discuss these issues of how individual financial security is being impacted by changes in the energy sector? Yes, Carl, please.
I'm sure others will have something on this, but I just wanted to chime in there and say we've been doing some work with Ofgem to bring in the voice of lived experience of poverty, to inform some of the policy making that they do. One of our chief concerns really is that there is often a lack of empathy in policy making, and that's no shade or blame for anyone who is creating those policies, but often their lives are very different to the lives of those people who are most affected by the ways in which policy is set. And obviously there'll be shades of grey here. That won't be the case in all regulators. Some will be better than others, but broadly speaking, there is that disconnect, and we kind of want to bring want to bridge that disconnect. And one of the ways of doing that is to stop it being a case that there's consumer advocates. I kind of want to do myself out of the job, but like the advocacy should be self-generated. It should, you know, we should be listening to people whose experience and livelihoods will be able to give a much deeper breadth of experience that can hopefully shape the way in which government, regulators, etc., do things in the future. And we can only try, but it's going all right so far.
Do you think technology helps with that? I mean, in theory, it allows far more people to be able to voice their opinions.
But yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's something to be said for the fact that there's more and more ways to be able to continually not just communicate, because fair enough, not everyone has a smartphone, but certainly if the costs of the technology are borne by government, borne by particular interest groups or firms, then that can be very good. And I know an example of this, there's the Energy Systems Catapult have got what they call a living lab. It's an organization, it's kind of industry adjacent organization. They have a living labs, and within that living lab where they're designing and testing and learning from different innovations around energy equipment, around energy technology. They also have a fuel poverty bar. So a proportion of the people in that living lab program are facing fuel poverty. And the things that they want to test and inclusively design around real people's lives, the technology is more or less kind of invested in by that organization because they see some research and development opportunities there. It's not fronted, the cost isn't fronted by the households themselves. Mm-hmm. So technology plays a part as long as the costs for that technology is not all, it's not assumed that consumers themselves will be able to afford that technology, because that won't be the case for everyone.
Yeah, no, sure, thank you. Any other thoughts from the panel? Luke.
I mean, I think the only thing I'd add is that, you know, that's part of the reason why we went down the route of doing the citizens' juries that we did as part of our commission. You know, I don't see, I don't think anyone suggested this, but I think we don't necessarily see kind of deliberative democracy, and whether that's citizens' juries or assemblies is any way like a replacement for representative democracy, but it is definitely a strong accompaniment to it. And that's why we, you know, it's transformed our work at IPPR. We kind of to start every project with a presumption of how do we involve people, not whether. And so we still do our kind of usual thing of, you know, doing quantitative analysis, getting experts from academia, government, business around the table to discuss the issues. But we also try in every project as far as possible to involve the public as well, and making sure it's kind of representative. And I think technology has helped, as I agree with that. Like, actually, we were imagining holding 4 citizens' juries in person across the country, and then the pandemic hit, and we had to hold them all remotely. And there were advantages to that. There were people, there were carers, people who had young children who wouldn't have been able to travel but were able to do it, and people that would just never would have been involved in that kind of thing, but they found it easier to actually log on through Zoom. And of course, there were also difficulties and drawbacks to doing that, because people with particular disabilities or other might find it difficult to use the technology, but providing the support to people to engage, I think is really important. As one of my colleagues always says, like, you know, people are kind of experts in their own lives and their own communities, and that should be making as big a contribution to policy development as people who are kind of expert in the sexual subjects that's under discussion.
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. The reason I asked about digital was actually because I was thinking about opportunities through fintech or through open banking to actually monitor more clearly the way in which people are spending and their spending changes and the distribution of their income across the various different categories. It seems to me that maybe the technology institutions are not as involved as they could be in answering these questions that you're raising today, but maybe I'm just missing them. Certainly don't seem to be any hands going up telling me that they exist. I was curious listening to Emma and thinking about the fact that people are clearly engaged with some elements of ESG, which obviously goes much further than the issue of energy, for example. We know that the news reports constantly tell us about the damage that climate change is causing and various other natural disasters. But I wonder whether we're really using these opportunities when the press talk about things to actually help people to understand the implications moving forward for them and their household budget, and whether there are any obvious links between the kind of high stress disaster stories and the everyday money management stories. Is there anybody that you're aware of that's joining those two stories together and actually helping people to see the connection on a day-by-day basis?
You have the Make Money Matter campaign, which is looking at getting pensions to invest more responsibly. I think, I suppose what we found in our study is that connecting people to the local issues is likely to be more engaging than the broader issues. I think what we're seeing in the comments is that doesn't negate the value of tackling this at a community, a local, a national, and an international level. And we have to think about all of those levels. But in terms of engaging people in those issues, it does seem to be that taking a local focus of things like the living wage, for example, is likely to have perhaps a bigger impact than talking about fires and floods and things that we see less here, that feel slightly less visceral to us sort of locally. Having said that, I do also think that there is a responsibility to, if people are not engaged in their pension, it's perhaps the only place that they invest in some of these companies, that it is that the provider has an obligation, perhaps greater than the individual, and that the sort of default funds that people are in should be thinking about these sort of responsibly invested options, and that might be for climate, but it might be other social governance type issues as well. It's such a complex sort of matrix of decisions to make, and from the discussion you can see how hard it is to balance all of that together. But raising the awareness for individuals, I think, and having some transparency over how you are making those judgments is probably beneficial.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you very much. Johnny?
So we've been doing some deliberative work at RF as part of this mega project we're doing with the LSE called Economy 2030. And one of the things we found in terms of people making green or sustainable choices in sort of focus groups that my colleagues have been working on is that people are very much up for making these decisions, up for things being greener. No one's inherently opposed to low carbon or sustainably sourced or responsible products and services, but there is, it's particularly amongst lower income groups, there's a real sort of busyness of life and a real sort of hassle factor, which often isn't accounted for, where people don't want to have to make these decisions. They want the green option to be regulated and for products to be green. They don't want to have to think, oh, I should spend a bit more on this and it'll be greener. They want the green option to be the option and the sustainable option to be the option, which again sort of feeds into sort of the wide, if you know, going back to the sort of the wider sort of environmental movement and the issue between individual action and non-individual action, you know, sort of the balance between those two, as we move, as Luke said, as we move to the sort of the stage of decarbonisation that impacts on people rather than impacts on power stations. That sort of really needs to be addressed in a way that, you know, when people have a lot going on, and especially at the moment when life is tough for huge swathes of the country, to be forced to just like think about things that, you know, don't need to take up mental space. You know, it's a real sort of issue that needs to be solved, and you know, we're looking at more stages of this through this like Economy 2030 project about how to incorporate these sort of standards in not just sort of environmental standards, but standards across sort of the country, I guess. So, you know, to make sure that we don't, you know, to make sure that companies pay the minimum wage and treat their staff properly, and that you don't have to try and figure out what every company does when you buy their products or services, just to make sure that is part of, I guess, of the way that the UK operates, the way the UK's economic strategy shapes up. So there's more now on our website, of course, Economy 2030, but that's part of the RF website, but that's what we've been doing on it.
Great, thank you very much. We're actually at the end of the discussion time that's been allocated, so I'm going to make the decision to turn back to Louise to see if there's anything else that you'd like to follow up on.
Thanks, Adele. No, so we'll just finish with a few comments then, and the all-important thank yous. But I think what's become very clear today is that this is a very wide-ranging, far-reaching issue, one that's beyond the remit of today's conference, beyond this particular focus on financial security or insecurity, which of course is very much the mainstay of CHASM's research agenda. And whatever we do to reduce carbon emissions, to transition to net zero, to try and meet some of these sustainability goals, we must keep the issue of inequality, the way that this transition is experienced unequally by different groups, very much at the heart. So it's given us lots of food for thought. I think, as I said at the beginning, it's a sort of emerging research agenda for CHASM. In a way, it's very much a cross-cutting theme, we hope. So we will be bearing all of this in mind as we think ahead to the work that perhaps we do and the stakeholders that we engage with. Thank you primarily to our speakers. Thank you to Carl, to Luke, to Emma, to Johnny. Thanks for your presentations. Thanks for giving us your time today. And thank you, of course, to Adele for chairing the panel, and thanks in particular to Matt for giving that really insightful response. Last but not least, thank you to everybody for joining, and thank you to Davina, to Ella, and to Helen, who keep the show on the road, to our professional services team that helped to do all of the organising and have helped to put the annual report together for us in time and made the last minute changes to move all of this online. We absolutely couldn't do it without you. So please do have a look at our annual report on the website now if you're interested, and we will be resuming our monthly CHASM seminar series, which many of you I know sign up to in September. So have a good summer and we will see you there.
Thank you very much. Oh, bye. From that side.